Welcome to this specially arranged webinar tonight for the TFA. We are having an exclusive DEFRA farming policy update, and this is something for all of our members and any of our guests who joined us tonight so that we can understand what it is tenant farmers need to know. My name is George Dunn, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Mike Rowe, who's the Director for the Farming and Countryside Program within DEFRA, sometimes called Janet Hughes 2.0, I think. And we also have our own Farm Policy Advisor, Lynette Steele, on the panel, and together with Lynette we have Tom Lewis, who's the Sustainable Farming Incentive Policy Lead at DEFRA, to answer some of your questions tonight. So while people are still joining us, and I apologize, we were a couple of minutes late as we were trying to get panel members onto the call, let me tell you that we are very, very pleased and grateful to Roy Thorns Solicitors, who are our sponsors for our TFA virtual events and knowledge share videos. For those of you who don't know Roy Thorns, it's a national firm of solicitors steeped in agriculture, 90 years of experience advising landowners and tenant farmers. And their lawyers are active in various farm tenancy policy groups, and they certainly do get the bigger picture. So whether you've got an issue around succession or a farm business tenancy or a share farming agreement or even a collaborative natural capital agreement, Roy Thorns is there for you to provide assistance. So before we get started, what I'll say is if you miss any of tonight's webinar or you want to watch it back, it is being recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel. So to find our channel on YouTube, just search at Tenant Farmers, and our video library features all of our past virtual events, our knowledge shares, our teach-ins, and key news updates. So we encourage you to pay a visit and subscribe to the channel so that you're not missing out on any new content as we load it up there. So just before I ask Mike to come and give us the benefit of his wisdom and knowledge right now, I just thought I would set the scene as to where we have got to. And perhaps I could take you back to the heady days of June 2016, when we were all merrily trotting off to the polling stations to cast our votes in the EU referendum, with lots of thoughts in our heads, including those which thought it would be good to get our hands back on the levers of agricultural policy. Now, having made the decision to leave the EU, and whether you're with Mr. Farage in assessing that it was all about getting back control of our borders and our democracy, or whether you're with Mr. Alistair Campbell, who referred to Brexit as the biggest economic blunder and active economic self-harm in British history, what the TFA said at the time was as follows: we need to build a new consensus for a post-Brexit food, farming and environmental policy involving the farming community, environmental groups, consumers, the health agenda, our place within the world on trade, aid and development, and we must have a policy framework that will last and which will not be subject to the winds of short-term political change, and no one organization or political party has the ability to achieve that on its own. We must consider the full landscape of policies and practices which affect the management of agricultural land, including how production standards are developed and enforced, the operation of markets, taxation, tenancy law, risk management tools, environmental and planning regulation, support for research and development, including technology transfer, and access to land for new entrants, progressing farmers, and allowing dignified routes for retirement for older farmers. We concluded by saying the biggest risk to making a success of our EU departure would be a lack of ambition in making maximum use of the flexibility that leaving will provide for Britain. So the exam question for tonight is, how are we doing in that respect? Now, a previous boss of one of our speakers tonight, Mr. Michael Gove, when he was in DEFRA, told us that rather than devoting intellectual energy and political capital to campaigning for policy interventions designed to insulate farming from change, agriculture's leaders can respond to growing public interest in debates about food, animal welfare, the environment, health and economic justice by demonstrating how their innovative and dynamic approaches are enhancing the environment, safeguarding animal welfare, producing food of the highest quality, improving public health, and contributing to a fairer society. Now, Mr. Gove produced a seminal consultation in 2018 known as Health and Harmony, and I would dare to suggest that it was a document which we could probably all get behind. And when we eventually left the European Union on the 31st of January 2020, and Health and Harmony had turned into the Future Farming and Countryside Programme, and to cut a very long story short, since then we've had the sequential removal of BPS, we've had the SFI pilot, we've had SFI 2022, we've had SFI 2023, probably the best scheme for arable farmers that we've had, and then SFI 2024, where we approached a good scheme for livestock and the uplands, and then, of course, the abrupt closure of the scheme in March of last year. The legacy schemes of HLS and countryside stewardship appear to be hanging on like Jacob Marley's chains, and in the interim, we have had not a lot to write home about until, of course, what our new Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Emma Reynolds MP, had to tell us at the Oxford Farming Conference. And at this point, I now would like to introduce to you Mike Rowe, as I said, the DEFRAs Programme Director for the Farming and Countryside Programme, and he's going to help us understand where we go next and what our members need to do to plan for the future. And following Mike's remarks, then we will have a bit of a response from our Farm Policy Advisor, Lynette, before we go to Q&A. So, as I said, Mike is the Director for Farming and Countryside Programme. He is responsible for the suite of environmental land management schemes, has been with DEFRA for a very long period of time, and took up this posting in June of last year. So, Mike, I'm going to give the floor to you, and we're going to be absolutely riveted in what you've got to tell us.
I can't fail but not to live up to that write-up. Thank you ever so much, George, for the hospital pass there. Well, look, seriously, thank you for the introduction, for the kind words, and also for the invitation to join this evening. You don't need me to tell you and your members that the fact that a third of all farmland in England is managed by tenant farmers makes this a hugely important sector, and therefore a hugely important organisation for us to be wanting to proactively engage with. And I should say, not just to get an easy run on the Q&A later, George, but your organisation is very well served by you. I've known you for many years, and your skills at lobbying and getting things done in the corners of Whitehall that many other people don't know even exist are exemplary, so much so that you often give me a hard time. But despite that, I've still come and appeared before you and your membership today. But it's because that sector makes such an important contribution to agriculture in England, which is why I was so delighted to take up the opportunity. Although, as George and Lynette will know, I'm always keen to do engagement, but I always like to do engagement when there's a clear purpose to it. And I'll try and sort of hone what I talk to you about to a couple of key topics where there's a genuine opportunity right now to hear your voice and to influence and shape policies that I'm currently responsible for leading on. As George mentioned, I could have listened to his history lesson for quite some time because he rightly said I've been in DEFRA for almost 25 years now. And I think over my time in DEFRA, over half of that time has been working on agricultural policy in one way, shape or form. And whilst I obviously won't comment on the politics of June 2016, at that time I was responsible for leading the Common Agricultural Policy. So we just managed to introduce new rules regarding greening and the three crop rule and the active farmer test that some might remember came out of the 2014 EU agricultural reforms. And then the referendum quite literally changed everything for DEFRA and for farming in many, many ways in June 2016. And I was asked straight at the point after the referendum to lead the initial thinking on developing essentially the blueprint for future agricultural policy that we are now operating today, and for trying to make sure that we got an agriculture bill into the Queen's speech in the next year, but also that it had the right powers in to enable us to have the policies that we need. As George mentioned, I'm primarily responsible for the suite of ELM schemes for the capital grants that you'll be familiar with, but I'm also responsible for farm advice and collaboration and an overview of farming regulation. as well as developing the farming roadmap and coordinating the government's overall response to the BATA's review of farm profitability. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm responsible for all agricultural policy or all tenancy issues. So I'll be able to say more on those aspects in the Q&A session that follows, George. But for other things, I will do my best to answer them. But it might be I need to take some more specific questions away on tenancy policy, as I think you'll understand. But I will commit to getting answers to George and the team. So I'm going to talk in particular around two main live policy topics, and I'll probably lean more towards the first than the second. So the first is around the sustainable farming incentive and the reforms that we've got in train there, where I'll give you a brief recap of what our Secretary of State Emma Reynolds said at the Oxford Farming Conference. And this is a genuine opportunity now for us to reflect on the views from you and other stakeholders to try and shape some of the detail that sits beneath the decisions that ministers have set out. We're right in the thrust of putting advice to ministers and doing the engagement that they've committed to. And they've also asked us to work in partnership with stakeholders as we finesse the details of the scheme. So the sort of comments and questions that we get today will genuinely help us form that advice to ministers. And we know that the sector is demanding clarity and certainty as early as possible. And that's something I'm keen to deliver under my responsibility. So I will major on the sustainable farming incentive, if that's okay, but obviously happy to take and hear any thoughts or questions about the other schemes that I've mentioned I'm responsible for. The other thing I'll mention very briefly, and probably at quite a high level, is the farming roadmap that ministers have said they want us to produce as well. Again, they've committed to doing that in partnership with industry. And whilst I won't sort of expect everyone to be itching to spend hours and hours on a Tuesday evening thinking about long-term government strategy, I think there's some quite crunchy questions I'd like to put to you and your members, George, in order to get what I know will be frank and honest and helpful feedback. So those are the two things I was going to talk about. I'm really sorry I haven't got sort of loads of slides to bamboozle you with. I will try and get a pace that's not too difficult to keep up with, but I might be able to share my notes afterwards, George, and clearly if this is going to be recorded, others can catch up at their leisure. So let's touch on the sustainable farming incentive first. And I might just give a little bit of the background behind what our Secretary of State announced at the Oxford Farming Conference only 19 days ago. She has delivered on a promise that this is right at the top of her inbox in terms of issues to sort. She was only appointed in September, and when you factor in some of the conference recess that we've had, our new ministers are relatively fresh in post, but they're getting to grips with the issues and the details really quite quickly. And we were quite pleased that we were able to say as much as we did in January at Oxford Farm Conference about how we want to change the scheme. I think ministers have been surprisingly candid about just some of the mistakes that happened last year when we had to close the scheme at no notice. And she's made she's not hidden the fact that in her view, SFI had become too complex, the fact that the unexpected closure of SFI last year damaged trust and confidence in the scheme, and also that too much of the available funding seemed to be absorbed by bigger farms. So against that sort of backdrop, there are various announcements that she made that I'm sure people would have picked up on, and I can try and unpack them further in the Q&A if helpful. Firstly, that we'll be opening the scheme later this year, and we're going to do that in a two-stage approach. So firstly, there'll be an initial window that will open from June, and I can't be more specific about when in June yet at this point. But that initial window will just be for small farms, and we're working and engaging with stakeholders on how to define small farms to get the level right, but also for farms that don't currently have an existing environmental land management agreement. And the reasons for that, ministers are keen to try and get a better degree of fairness in terms of where that funding is being spread. We also have a new target under our environmental improvement plan that was published in December to double the number of farms providing sufficient resources for wildlife by 2030. So there's a definite keenness that in order to hit that environmental target, we need to be trying to make it easier for people not in schemes to come into schemes. So that'll be a sort of priority boarding style early access window from June for those small farms and for people without agreements. And then from September onwards, a second window opened that will be available for all farms, including those eligible for the first window. So even if that period June to September doesn't quite work, you'll still be able to apply in that second window. Some of the other things that ministers have been really clear about the scheme that they want to essentially roll out later this year, that Emma Reynolds said at the CLA conference last year, it'd be an evolution of what we've had previously, not a revolution. I think ministers have heard loud and clear from a number of quarters that the sort of constant chopping and changing of schemes doesn't make it easy to plan, doesn't introduce predictability. So we're not looking at sort of wholesale changes starting from scratch. It's more about how can we improve the offer, simplify it and make it fairer. But ministers are keen that they want the SFI bit of the ELMS offer to work alongside agricultural production and food production, not to displace it. So that's one of the things that they're charging us with looking at. I think we've had some anecdotal evidence that quite often whole holdings or entire fields have been put into certain environmental options because it was more lucrative than farming for the market and then doing maybe 10, 20% in arable options, for example. The ministers are very clear that food production is a priority for them. So rewiring the scheme such that it doesn't displace agricultural production is one of the key things they've asked us to bring forward in terms of changes. And we're working with George and others on how best to do that. They do want us to make SFI simpler and more focused, and there's a couple of elements behind that. Firstly, the environmental improvement plan that I mentioned does give us some hard targets that the government is now legally required to meet in terms of biodiversity and water in particular, as well as that one around doubling the number of farms, delivering the right resources for wildlife. So it means we've got to be a bit more choosy in terms of the offer that we put out there to make sure that ideally the options that people choose will make a contribution towards those targets. And as a result of that, we also think there's scope to reduce the number of actions. This also helps in terms of the delivery of the scheme as well, I should say. But I think we know that SFI 23 had only 23 actions, whereas SFI 24 had around 102. And for every action that we produce, that requires system support, advisor support. We have to have rules about how they interact. We need to do a whole host of cross-checks to make sure that public money is protected. And it also needs large amounts of documentation and material that farmers need to wade through. So we've been given a very clear steer to try and look at how can we get that sweet spot of the right mix of actions that will keep the scheme attractive and something that people want to come into, but also reduce the complexity, make it easier for people to access and understand. So that's one of the things we're working through as well. I mentioned that ministers are keen that we look at improving fairness and accessibility. They want as many people as possible to be able to benefit from agreements. We don't have a limitless budget though. So we've got to try and work out ways in which we can make the available budget that we've got go further. So in addition to looking at which actions we might take out of the scheme, we're also looking at some of the payment rates where I think candidly we probably set them too high and lots of people piled in because they can make quite a fair bit of money from it. And that also means there's then an opportunity cost in that other people can't get in agreements if the money's being sort of absorbed too quickly. So we're looking carefully at which ones do we think we can bring down and try and, again, keep that calibration between something that will work for our environmental commitments and work alongside agricultural production. There's also things that we're considering in terms of looking to cap the amount of actions that can be done on a certain holding. So we know that for some fields, they might put entire fields into certain options, whereas for others, they're capped at around about 25% of the holding. And again, if we get the right mix here and the right balance and the right calibration, we can deliver the right things for the environment, keep food production ongoing, but also mean that there's more money that can be spread around so that as many people as possible can have an agreement. One thing that I suspect might be something that this sector are quite keen on is looking at potentially reducing those 5-year actions and turning them into 3-year actions, which might make it easier for some tenant farmers to get into agreements. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. I should say no fixed decisions have been taken on all of this, and we don't know if we'll be able to do everything we might want to do because we've got system constraints and we're keen to get the scheme open and live as early as possible so that everyone has certainty. But we're working with George and other stakeholders to gauge sort of relative priorities against the principles that ministers have set out. There's definitely something that we're looking at in terms of how can we improve certainty and transparency. We know the damage that was caused last year when the window was shut quite quickly because the money was used up. I think we've got some experience in running a capital grants offer last year that we're keen to build from in terms of how can we give more of a commentary on how much budget is left so that even if we have closures that will happen, they're not so sudden and not so unexpected, and we try and manage expectations so that people can get through. And I think some of the other things that we're looking at, so number and type of actions I briefly mentioned, we are considering, as Emma Reynolds said, should we cap the overall value of an agreement? Again, that can make sure that money is available for as many agreements as possible if we put a limit on the total size of an agreement. We've got those 2 windows and we need to work to make sure that we get the eligibility criteria right for each of those so that people know which window they can apply for. And as I mentioned, we're looking at how do we define a small farm so that people can understand that. We are considering increasing some of the payment rates for moorland options in particular. We're very keen to ensure that SFI remains something that is workable for upland farms. But equally, on the converse of that, we're looking at some of the most popular actions that we've got and the management payments think, have we set either payment rates too high or are there changes that we can make that, again, would allow the money to go further? So this, I guess, is a range of things that we're sort of toying with. We've not taken fixed or final decisions on all of this, but there's quite a lot of scope and parameters. And the thing we're really keen to do with George and other stakeholder organisations is really get that calibration right in terms of improving the scheme so that it's better than the one that we had last year, but without losing what's been welcomed from the schemes. Keeping that right balance between a scheme that works alongside agricultural production but also delivers value for the public purse as well as those environmental outcomes. An absolute priority for me, given my history in DEFRA, is making sure that we keep stabilised delivery of the schemes and we don't try and bite off more than we can chew in terms of what the system or RPA capacity can do. That's essential to keep confidence in the system. But again, as ministers have said, they also want a scheme that is simpler and fairer and easier for small farms and those without agreements to enter into. And obviously, a key thing from us is making sure that we make best use of the full available budget that we've got, because we know that times are tight. So on SFI, I appreciate there's a lot there, George, but I know you've been managing your members and doing some engagement on our behalf. So hopefully that sounds sort of broadly familiar to what we've been talking about. And I'd be really keen to hear any thoughts on any or all of that when we go into the Q&A session. Equally, if people have got concerns around some of the higher tier offer that we've got, or landscape recovery or capital grants, I'm very happy to try and pick those up and address them and take those away. I should say as well, I do know that for some of the landscape recovery agreements, which is the sort of newest bit of the ELMS offer, in some areas, tenant farmers are having particular issues, and we are working to address those and working to build the experience that we've had from those first rounds of projects into the guidance, into the standard implementation agreement that we have, so that we build that learning into future rounds, because I appreciate there have been some issues that have been raised. And again, very happy to hear about that. And then in terms of next steps on SFI, ministers are the ones that make announcements about timetables and things like that. But let me just say, ministers are very keen to get information out as soon as possible. They have committed that the first window will open in June. We want to be in a position well in advance of that to give people as much certainty as we can about the scheme, so that they can think about whether or not they want to apply for it and what's on the table. And equally, another thing that Emma Reynolds has said that I hope will be well regarded by George and colleagues, not least given one of his remarks earlier, is we're really keen to try and stabilise the offer on SFI for the rest of the Parliament, so that you know what to expect if you're coming out of an agreement in future years. Now, that doesn't mean to say we'll lock everything in concrete and not do anything. If we can improve it, enhance it, make some tweaks, we absolutely will do. But what we want to do is sort of give people enough certainty that, broadly speaking, the main offer will remain the same for the rest of this Parliament, so that people can plan accordingly. And I think I've got maybe 3 minutes if I've timed it right, George, because we did start a little bit late because of tech problems. But the other thing I wanted very quickly to just flag, and maybe put a bit of a challenge to you and some of your members in terms of where we'd really value input, is the farming roadmap that's been talked about for a couple of Secretary of State now, I should say. So I think it was last year, Steve Reed, when he was our Secretary of State, announced the intention to try and set out a 25-year strategy or vision for the industry, to try and ensure that government sets out a plan for farming to make it more environmentally sustainable, more profitable, more productive, and more financially sustainable and resilient for the long term. That is something that Emma Reynolds, a commitment she's doubled down on, and she said at the Oxford Farming Conference that we'll be working on that in the first half of this year. And in the spirit of partnership that she also mentioned at that conference, she's very keen that we work and develop it in tandem with stakeholders in the industry, rather than it being one of those horrible classic 200-page documents that government prepares and then sort of lands on industry and stakeholders. And I'm saying this because we've generally got an opportunity now to shape this, and we're in the process of holding a series of workshops to try and canvass views around what people think should be in the roadmap. We want to try and sort of set out as far as we can, because if we were crystal ball gazers and knew with certainty what's going to happen, we'd probably be in different jobs. But what do we think the long-term trends affecting the industry are? What are the long-term effects of climate change that we might need to be preparing for? What's the role of private financing in the sector? How will trade affect the farming sector? What do we want in terms of domestic production and increased domestic production? The environmental targets I mentioned earlier, many of those are longer term, and the closer we get to them, they will start to bite, particularly with regards to climate change. And how can we help you as a sector make sense of all the sort of government initiatives and strategies, whether or not it's the Environmental Improvement Plan, Minute Batters Report, and how we respond to that, the land use framework, which ministers have said will be published very soon, and try and sort of set out in as clearer terms as possible what we think that long-term direction for 25 years looks like. What is it that government and society wants from this sector? And equally, what is it that you as a sector want back from government in terms of certainty for planning? So that's not going to be an easy trick to pull off. And I genuinely do not want to sort of foist a 200-page PDF on the world and say, there you go, it's done and dusted. So how we get that right balance of enough detail and enough coverage and enough certainty, noting that we won't have full knowledge of everything and everything that might change, is going to be a trick for us to pull off. But I guess a simple question for us that I'd quite like to pose just in the last 30 seconds that I've got really is for you as a sector, and I've heard George only recently as last night talk about this with the Secretary of State. What are the biggest blockers to you becoming more profitable, more productive, and more sustainable? And what do you need from government to help address those blockers? Because if we can capture that and articulate it, the challenge is for me and my team to try and translate that into the roadmap in a way that's meaningful, not just for this sector, but also for the whole of the industry. And that in the crux, and in a nutshell, is what we're trying to get the roadmap to do. How can we, what can government do to make the industry as a whole over that 25-year period more profitable, more productive, more sustainable? George, I'll end there. Hopefully I've not overshot my time, but
no, Mike, that was great. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and being with us tonight. And thank you also for your very kind words about the role and influence of the Tenant Farmers Association. It's good to hear that we are doing some good work with you and your colleagues within DEFRA. So before we get into the Q&A, and what I'd say to anybody who's on tonight, if you want to ask a question, can you please put it in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, and I'll try to pick as many up as I can in the second half of our time together tonight. We have had a raft of questions in advance as well, so there's quite a lot to cover, but I'm sure Mike and Tom won't mind taking away those questions if they haven't been able to answer live tonight. So we'll take that opportunity. But just before we get into the Q&A, I'm going to introduce Lynette, who's at the pointy end of all of this lobbying that we're doing at the moment on the SFI and the Farming and Countryside program. Lynette is our farm policy advisor. She's been with us since 2018, and she farms alongside her husband in Hampshire, not far from the TFA head office. And she's going to just give us an overview of what the TFA is feeling and thinking at the moment with all of the policy announcements that we've had from the Secretary of State and obviously tonight from Mike. So Lynette, over to you. And I should say Lynette is suffering with a massive cold, so we thank her for taking the opportunity to be with us tonight, but please bear with her if she splutters her way through her little presentation. Thanks, Lynette.
No, thank you very much, George, and thank you, Mike, for a really good canter through where we are, and really for being so candid to all our members who are attending this evening to kind of delve into the detail, which maybe we didn't hear at the Oxford Farming Conference. It's been a really good start to the year. Things are feeling quite positive about the engagement that we're having, and hopefully we can continue in that vein. And I think all our members would be pleased to hear really that the Minister is keen that SFI going forward does not displace food production, which has been a major problem for tenant farmers over the past couple of years. And I know that we've submitted evidence to DEFRA where maybe tenants have been displaced because of large landowners going into schemes. So it's good we're readdressing that balance, and it feels like that's something that all stakeholders which are engaging at the moment with DEFRA are very much very keen on ensuring is taken forward. And actually, with that engagement we've had as stakeholders, it's all felt really positive, and that everybody's moving in the same direction, which again is just quite nice to hear at this point where we've been waiting for a long time, that we can kind of hopefully make some really big steps going forwards. Clear, transparent plans for SFI moving forward are key, and we've discussed previously with DEFRA about it's so key to ensure our members can plan their businesses not just in the short term but in the medium and long term. And I think we have to recognise that SFI maybe in the next iteration of it might not be right for every farming business, and so it's important that members and farming businesses can understand what that offer is and whether that is right for them or not. I appreciate DEFRA have big targets of getting more land managers into the scheme, but at this time where things are pretty tight, I think we also have to acknowledge that some sectors might want to just go for production rather than environmental as well. So that's really key, that transparency going forward. I think we've got a lot of work to do on the details of eligibility for window one and window two, and how small farms are defined. And it's probably not just as easy as kind of a small farm is, whatever area we want to say, which have got 60 milking cows or something like that. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. One thing we are particularly concerned about, though, is maybe those farms which have a very small area into a historic scheme, into SFI 23 or 24, they dip to toe. And that, now that they have a small area in there, means that they wouldn't be able to get into that window one of SFI, because we were promised previously, with the scheme design, that you would be able to add each year into the scheme. So that's something that we are talking about with DEFRA and trying to raise them. I think it's also nice to hear that you said that the scheme won't be stagnant, although obviously we don't want to keep adding options in. Certainly we don't need any more than 102 options, that's for sure. But SFI was built on flexibility for the future, working towards something that's going to work for all sectors is really important, all types of farms, to make it simpler, more streamlined, and hopefully easier for people to make applications, because SFI 24 was complex, wasn't it? So I think, you've covered some really good points this evening. It's really great to hear that pretty much everything I've written on my list, you've nicely covered off. One thing I think is really important is guidance, and I'm not talking about guidance in what do I need to do to achieve those actions. I think, you've talked a lot this evening about the targets of the environmental improvement plan. I think what we need to start doing is advising the industry what DEFRA needs to have done on farm to achieve those targets, because giving us a PDF of 200 pages doesn't tell us what you need. We as an industry need to deliver on those environmental targets, because quite frankly, if we don't, the Treasury will look at the budget that we are given and say, you're not achieving it, so we're going to take it away. So that's a bit of a challenge to the industry as well as to yourself, that we need to all work together to deliver those environmental targets. So I do think we've got work to do on advice and guidance. And finally, just because I tend to talk about it a lot, so I'm just going to mention it one more time, is ensuring that people in historic agreements, countryside stewardship mid-tier extensions, HLS, they are able to enter into this new scheme. I know there's a huge amount, there's quite a few system barriers there which are causing issues, but we can't be in a position that we keep just offering extensions and rollovers for those people in those agreements. So they're kind of our top topics that I'm talking to Mike and DEFRA about, and our PA colleagues. And as Mike said, it's always great to kind of have the opportunity to hear from our members directly as well. So I will stop talking now, so there's plenty of time for a Q&A.
Lynette, thank you so much for that quick reaction to what Mike had to say, and members and those on the call should be aware that Lynette has already had a detailed discussion with DEFRA on this, and we'll be back in London tomorrow to have a further detailed discussion on all of this stuff. So we are very much heavily involved in how we take this thing forward. So we're going to go into our Q&A now, and I'm going to invite Tom Lewis to join us. Tom is the SFI policy lead at DEFRA, and my notes tell me he is a seasoned public servant, having had 17 years of experience with DEFRA and Natural England, and he's going to help Mike answer all of your questions tonight. So this is your opportunity to ask questions, so please use the Q&A box. I'm going to mix and match between what's live and what I've had in advance, but maybe Mike and Tom, I can start with that theme that Lynette sort of finished off with, because we've had quite a lot of questions from members, including Dougal online tonight, including a member from Salisbury called Andrew, a member from Staffordshire. Where are we on legacy schemes and the ability for people who are in legacy schemes to get into SFI? and the whole remit and framework around ensuring that there is a coherent package of measures that farmers can access.
Yeah, thanks, George, and thanks to those members who put the questions in. So a couple of quick thoughts on this. Firstly, and genuinely, one of the reasons why we and ministers are so keen to try and fix decisions on the shape of SFI as quickly as possible and to have those announced as quickly as possible and well in advance of that first window opening in June and then the second window opening in September, though we're not planning to change the scheme in between June and September. We want to fix the design, confirm it, and then run the two windows, is so that people in legacy agreements, whether or not they're higher tier or mid tier or existing SFIs, have got as early chance as possible to see what the offer is likely to be, and then they can start thinking about what's right for them. For some, it may well be that higher tier is the preferred route. Others might think that SFI, as we've refined it, is the right place to be. And that's, we want to spend the time over the summer, once the windows are opening, engaging with the sector, explaining the changes that we've made and helping farmers and other land managers think through, is it right for them? And I take Lynette's point as well, actually, about how if we can be a bit clearer about some of the options that you make the most difference in terms of hitting some of those environmental targets, there's definitely something we can do more of in that regard, so that you know exactly where we're coming from in terms of the conditions, if you like, that are attached to the money that we've secured in the budget. And we'll also provide transparency over that level of budget ahead of those windows opening. This has been clear on that. I think the one extra thing I'll say, although it's with heavy caveats, but one of the things that RPA are genuinely looking at is, will it be possible to change the system so that we can allow people to work up agreements before their existing agreement expires, which is something that is not possible at the moment. Now, I want to be really sort of careful on this. I cannot guarantee that we'll be able to do this, because when we're looking at all of the changes we might do in the round, we've only got so much system development time that RPA can use to modify or calibrate the system. And if we try and do too much, we'll risk jeopardizing the whole thing. But equally, it's one of the things that we are potentially looking at. So trying to get a range of views from stakeholders in terms of their relative priorities for some of the changes is really important for us, because if we can, and it doesn't destabilize things, introducing that functionality so that applications can be worked up in advance of an agreement ending is one way in which we can manage demand, manage budgets, and allow people to get greater certainty about which offers the right place for them to go when their existing agreement expires, because they'll be able to work up an application and see what that looks like. But please don't hold me to that. It's genuinely something we're exploring. We'll need to think and look if it's deliverable once we've looked at everything in the round.
So just on that point, Mike, obviously Dougal makes the point in one of his questions that these schemes have been delivering really good value for public money in terms of the environmental improvements and the environmental management that's been going on, and we don't want to lose that going forward. So are you saying that people can look forward to a time where there'll be no gaps between leaving one scheme and joining another?
I'm seasoned enough as a public servant to know that might be a promise I might not be able to keep, George. It's definitely one of the things that we've got on the table. And as I think you and others will know, we are looking to try and modernise the IT that we've got. That might provide us the opportunity potentially to start looking at things where we almost move away from the concept of scheme and just make it simpler in terms of what land have you got and what can you do with that land. I think the sort of rhythm of annual schemes and windows is still a bit of a hangover from our time in the Common Agricultural Policy. But again, I'm not going to overpromise in terms of when new IT will be available, but there's a longer term question, I think, conversation that I'm keen to have around what does the future offer look like in 5-10 years' time. I guess right now I'm being a bit choosy and picking on SFI because we're right in the spotlight in terms of putting advice to ministers, but I'm really open to have that longer term discussion around how we can improve things more broadly and strategically. And IT can help in that regard. Okay,
and just in terms of the budget, and obviously we had a bit of a budget crisis last year, which meant you had to close the scheme immediately. Maybe Tom, you can kick in on this one. How much money are you allocating to SFI in 2026? You told us previously that you were spending something like £525 million a year on SFI, but you're also spending a similar amount on BPS, which has obviously disappeared now. Are we going to see that up for the coming year? And how will we know if that money's running out and people aren't putting effort into bringing schemes together that are going to be going nowhere because you're going to close the window again?
Yeah, thanks, George. Good question. I'll pick this up on Tom's behalf. That's all right, Tom.
All right. Sorry, Tom.
That's okay.
So the high-level announcement in terms of the overall spending review envelope that we've got, details of that were made available last summer, I think it was, when the spending review was announced. We're in the process of working through with ministers the split between the schemes beneath that. Some of the issues around the design of SFI that we are like to will come up in that regard. So I'm not going to be able to be in a position to confirm those details now, but I think Emma Reynolds did say at the Oxford Farming Conference that ahead of windows opening, we will be able to say how much money there is for each of the windows. And it is definitely our intention that we'll give some sort of updates in terms of how much that budget has been used so that we manage expectations around the speed of the demand that we've got. So watch this space on that one, George, but it's a fair question.
Okay, let's get into this question about what's a small farm. There's concern about the fact that you are suggesting that a small farm is anything below 50 hectares, which might be okay for a livestock or dairy unit, but doesn't really work for upland farms. And are you including the common land area that those farms have? How are we going to make sure that you are not having a one-size-fits-all small farm policy for a sector that's very diverse?
Great. Well, having robbed the last question from him, Tom, do you want to take this one?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. So I think to start with, George, just the point about the common land. So I'm sure you'll be aware, the way that we deal with common applications has been that they're treated separately. So whatever definition we come up with in terms of a size of a small farm, and we are looking at using a hectareage basis for that rather than any other kind of measure. The area of common land would be separate to that. So that's the way that the system works, and that'll be, we'll share more information obviously about that before the window opens, but that's the approach with that. So in terms of size, and yeah, we absolutely appreciate that different enterprises, different sectors, different bits of the country, there are different sizes. I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to, as Mike said, spread the participation in the scheme as much as possible. Ministers are very keen that we look to do that. At the moment, when we look at the demographic of farmers, of land managers who are in SFI, there is a skew towards the larger farmers. And that is something we just do want to try and address through that first window. So it really is just an attempt to spread the participation in the scheme. But as I say, we'll be looking at a hectareage threshold to try and identify that. So that's the approach. And in terms of what those numbers are going to be, we are working with ministers, working with yourselves just to agree those, and we'll obviously confirm those as soon as we can.
So just taking that a bit further, Tom, in terms of the policy around bringing in more smaller farmers, we hear the Secretary of State and we hear Mike tonight talking about the concern that there is around the fact that the money seems to be skewed towards larger farmers. And we've had, obviously, in the BATA's review, the suggestion that the minimum area that people should have should be reduced from 5 hectares down to 3 hectares. But where's the sense in that? And where's your thinking around that? And does that actually deliver the environmental outcomes that you want to see? I mean, George Ranner tonight says, having lots of 1 hectare plots isn't really going to deliver what it is you want to see right across the farm landscape. So, and are you ready for the inundation of small farms that might come into the scheme, like we had with the dynamic hybrid for the SFS back in 2004 when we had 40,000 new applicants suddenly? Where's the data around this, and why is it a concern?
Yes, I mean, I suppose there's a few things in there. I suppose to start from one angle, and as I say, we know that different sectors have got different patterns of land uptake. We also know that as a sector, as a farming community, we need to make sure we've got new entrants coming into agriculture, and often those are folk who come in small pieces of land, and so we do just want to make sure that we have an opportunity for people to come through and come into farming. So there is a kind of a number of reasons why we want to make sure there's a distribution. As I say, some of it's about that new entrance. Some of our environmental targets are about creating habitat and species that actually you need little bits and bobs of all around the countryside. So for some of the things we're looking to create within SFI, actually it's good to have that have that kind of patchwork approach across the country. But look, we also know and realise the way the farming system and sector looks. We know how big farms are big, largely because they're profitable and because they take advantage of schemes, and we don't want to penalise that. So as I say, I think we're looking at this as a way to try and bring in additional people who haven't felt like they can join SFI previously. You'll be well aware, many of the folk on the call will be aware that a lot of these small farmers could have applied last year. They didn't. So we're looking at ways to see whether there were barriers, there were any issues in terms of the way the scheme was designed that prevented that uptake. So really, this is that focus. It's probably only going to be something we do in this first window this year to try and spread the participation in the scheme. As I say, for those kind of reasons. So that's kind of where we're at and what we're looking at. I mean, we do share stats and data about farm size, which there's a DEFRA stats unit that shares all of that. So we are aware about the as I say, the proportion of different farm sizes in the scheme.
Okay, so getting a bit more into the detail, we've talked a bit about potential for maybe putting some caps on things, so limits on options and how much you can include within an option, and maybe overall scheme limits. Can you just maybe flesh out a bit more what you're thinking around that? So where should we expect to see options limited? What sort of limitations might you apply? And what sort of overall level of expenditure are you willing to pay per farm? I mean, we know for those that had to were allowed to come back in again on the startup but not submitted had a £9,000 limit, which would be far too low in our view in terms of the extent to which we need to attract people into the scheme. So what is your thinking around those sorts of limits at the moment?
Yeah, should I sort of pick that up to start with, George? So the honest answer is we haven't got fixed views on this, and this is something we're trying to calibrate with you and others. I think Minister said at the Oxford Farming Conference that something like 25% of the available budget went to just 4% of farms, and it's that sort of distribution or skewing, as I think you use the phrase, that they're keen to sort of at least try and address in terms of how we redesign the scheme. Because for every sort of agreement that's over, say, 100,000 in value, that's potentially 5 farms that can't get an agreement worth 20,000 in value, and that could be a useful income stream as well as useful delivery of environmental outcomes. So we're trying to get that calibration right. We don't want to lose the valuable outcomes that we've been securing, but ministers are unashamedly clear that they want to spread the money further. They want as many people to have agreements. And maybe just pick up a couple of things that I've also seen in the chat, and thank you for people putting in there. The thing around that target around doubling the number of farms, it's specifically tied to providing sufficient wildlife resource and providing that year round. So there will be some limitations around that in terms of farm size, hectareage, and the amount of land we want managed. But I do think we've got some evidence going back quite some years. I don't know if people remember the John Lawton review that talked about how if you get positive environmental action happening in pockets across the country, you get extra synergistic benefits because you create mosaics of habitats, you create wildlife corridors, as opposed to if you just have all of the money being spent on deep actions in one place. So we do have some good stats that actually positive action happening everywhere and as wide as possible delivers more than the sum of its parts, so to speak. But equally, we are mindful of the administrative capacity that we've got, the outcomes that we've been buying, and we're really trying to strike that balance between how can we make it as easy as possible for as many people to come into these schemes, keeping it deliverable, keeping it simple, and without jeopardising what we've bought before. And it's not a simple answer, which is why we're so grateful for all the input and engagement we're getting from you and other organisations.
Okay, here's a specific question related to the Uplands, and it's a member from Devon who's on Dartmoor, and she asks, how can fixed stocking rates work in the Uplands? For example, given the topography is so different and the climate is so different, how can Cornwall and Cumbria be treated the same? Surely the outcomes for the environment will be jeopardized if we don't have site-specific stocking rates.
Oh, do you want to pick them?
Yeah, no, happy to. So no, it's a really good question because it is one of the most challenging areas we have in terms of how we set and how we agree those stocking rates. I think for a scheme like SFI, the approach we took was that we wanted to have standard actions, consistent actions that people could choose from. and there are a number of different stocking rate actions that upland farmers can choose from within the SFI scheme. So for SFI, as I say, we wanted there to be some consistent standard actions that people could choose from. Where there was a requirement for more bespoke support, advisor support or choice about the stocking rates, that was something that we very much see needing to be part of CS high tier, where that level of support and kind of negotiation can take place between the advisor and the farmer. So I think there's something in there a little bit about scheme design that as I say, we've tried to signpost different people, different choices to different schemes. And we do have a number of different actions within SFI with different stocking rate choices. So that's kind of how we've tried to approach that tricky question.
But because do you accept that the stocking rates that you are trying to impose are exceedingly low, and there is huge concern about wildfire risk by not having landscapes properly grazed?
So certainly it's challenging to get the agreement about stocking rates. I don't disagree with that. We're using advice, and the best advice we can get from within the DEFRA family and from outside about what the stocking rates need to be in different places for different situations. I think the challenge is about how we tailor those specific sites and the specific requirements. And I think that's the bit that, as I say, where we need that specific tailoring, that's where CS high tier probably is the kind of best way to go about doing that. But certainly appreciate there's a lot of difference, and the number of sites where we need to see stocking rates increased versus decreased. So we've tried to come up with an approach that covers that, but obviously we will keep looking at the uplands and keep looking at stocking rates.
Okay, and we have a bit of a blunt question here from a member. What options can we bank on not being available?
Okay, so what can we bank on? So no firm decisions have been made, as Mike says. So there isn't anything that's been completely switched into the kind of good or bad box. I think we're really focused on looking at where there's good value for money for taxpayers. We're focusing on where actions are popular with farmers. So we're trying to make that assessment about the kind of sweet spots in here, about the good value for money, the popular actions, the actions that support food production, the actions that are delivering for water quality and biodiversity. So as I say, we haven't got anything locked down today. But as I say, we're trying to approach this in a way that keeps as many, helps us hit as many targets as we can, but obviously has a really good coherent offer for farmers and farming.
Okay, broadening things out a little bit, and we've only got 5 minutes of our time left, and there's still stacks of questions coming in that we haven't yet answered. So apologies for my bad chairmanship. But just in terms of that concept around food security and ensuring that food production is part and parcel of this scheme going forward, we've had a few questions around that and the profitability challenges of the industry and the competition that we have from international markets, food coming into this country which isn't to the same standards that we produce here. How are we really going to square that circle to ensure that these schemes do not undermine our productivity as a nation in terms of food production, undermine our food security, and cause farmers to be open to the competition from abroad if our production is simply switched to production that comes in from abroad, produced at lower standards? That might be one for Mike rather than you, Tom. But Tom, you turned your mic off, so maybe you turn your mic off. Maybe you want to answer that one.
Well, I mean, I was just going to start, and Michael want to come in. I was just going to start on the point that we have tried to balance the actions that support sustainable food production, and I know it's something that we kind of roll out a lot, but a lot of those actions are very much intended to improve long-term sustainability around farming and food production. So that's something that we want to keep as the kind of core within SFI. And where we've had actions that take food out of production, those have been the ones that we've tried to limit in terms of those limited area actions. So we've tried to put those controls within the scheme, and as we've mentioned, we're going to look to keep doing that and keep that focus on our ability to produce food. But Mike might want to come in and finish off the answer.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It was a very clever question from George because it pulls together a whole host of issues, not all of which I'm responsible for in terms of imports and trade. But I think one of the things we're keen to do in the roadmap that I talked briefly about is to try and set all of this out in the round and think about, okay, what is it the government wants from this sector? How can we help it become more profitable, sustainable, productive? We know that productivity is something we need to address. We're less productive in terms of use of resources than some of our European cousins in certain sectors, and on others we've got a competitive advantage. So there's a whole host of work there we're trying to grapple with. I think we also recognise that farming is an industry that's exposed to global market forces. A couple of years ago, actually, the arable sector was in a very different position to how it was now, and the schemes that we calibrated weren't potentially as attractive as farming for that market. The position is very different, and almost in stark contrast to how maybe things were 10 years ago in beef and the livestock sector. Those have been doing pretty well recently, whereas previously I can remember having to think about how we get more livestock farms into schemes, because the opposite was true. I think what we're keen to do in the long term is try and get that sort of right balance between how we use regulation, incentives, and other government levers to make businesses profitable and resilient in all circumstances, so that we don't have that sort of buffeting. I think that's going to take a long time now. And again, we've been keen to focus tonight on things coming up in the next 6 months rather than the next 6 years and beyond. But that longer conversation is something we will develop as part of the roadmap. And George, I've been sort of trying to pick off a couple of questions, just conscious of time, and putting answers that hopefully have gone into the answer bit of the chat Q&A, and we'll keep doing that if that's all right by you. But hopefully that at least covers that one a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Mike. A couple of quick ones before we close then. John Holt asks, will organic farming be rewarded as they have been in the past with CS schemes?
Tom, do you want to come in on organics?
So certainly at the moment we have a number of actions for organic farmers, and as we've mentioned, and as Mike has mentioned, and as Secretary of State has mentioned, we're trying to streamline the number of actions that are available. But they're an important part of the SFI offer at the moment, and so we'll just be considering how and where they, what actions we streamline and how we get to that kind of slightly reduced number in a few that we can talk about in a few weeks' time.
Okay, and let's finish on a good old landlord-tenant question. Let's see whether Mike or Tom can answer this one. So Michael Summers says, is there scope to structure capital grants that will facilitate joint applications between landlords and tenants that result in synergies with respect to sector efficiency improvements while optimizing environmental outcomes? So can we find a way to allow landlords and tenants to jointly apply for capital grants?
Tom?
Go for it. I was going to say I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I was hoping you were going to go for it, Mike. But it's a really good question. There's a lot of detail in there, which I think we can obviously take these things away and have a look at how our capital grants work, and how they operate going forward. But yeah, that's a complicated question, isn't it? Which I think I haven't got a quick answer to, I'm afraid.
Mike, anything you want to say?
Yeah, Tom's right. So I've not heard of that proposal previously. In terms of the Elms capital grants, it's not one of the things that we currently provide, as I think you know. Whether or not we should add to it, if we can get it up and running and add to it, and ministers decide it's a priority relative to all the other uses of the potential money, I think the one thing on that might just be the delivery lead time for this year. So just to manage expectations, I think it'd be hard to go from zero to a brand new capital grant that does that in the short space of time that we've got. But George, if you and others sort of come through and we get that message that this is a good use of public money, that there's clear value that can be demonstrated in it and a clear need for it, then it's the sort of thing ministers will always listen to. But I know I'm fudging that a little bit, but honestly so.
Yeah, just to help you a little bit, it was a recommendation within the ROC review into agricultural tenancies, because we have situations where the fixed equipment on holdings is quite often the responsibility of the landlord to maintain or to improve. And it's only the tenant who can access the grants for capital schemes. And therefore, if the liability is with the landlord, the tenant can't really apply for the grant to apply that grant to a building that's the landlord. So you need to have a joint application where there's a joint approach to that. but we've heard that the RPA doesn't like necessarily to deal with more than one individual in terms of an application. So we just need to find a way around that to ensure that we are properly bringing the tenanted sector into play. So look, I'm really sorry to everybody. We haven't got through all of the questions tonight, but it was probably wishful thinking to think that we would get through all of the questions tonight. Mike and Tom have been manfully answering the questions in the chat box, and we will get those that we haven't answered to them both, so that we can get some maybe short written answers to those that we'll put on our blog posts. Mike's already put his thumbs up for that, so that's worked for Tom, I think there. So just before I close, I'd like to say a huge thank you again to Mike and also to Lynette for giving us those really good introductions and really good overviews, and to Tom for being here to answer those questions for us. It's been excellent. Just to let you know that we will, our next webinar is the first part of a two-part webinar where we're going to look at navigating farm rent reviews and what happens when negotiations break down and head towards arbitration. It's going to feature a couple of our expert recommended professionals, Ellie Allwood from Brown & Co. and Edward Briggs from Briggs & Stone, both who are agricultural arbitrators. So we're going to walk through a very detailed case study of a mixed holding on an Agricultural Holdings Act agreement and unpack that so that people can understand how to prepare and respond to proposals and what happens if you have to approach an arbitration. So if you want to feel more confident and better equipped about your next rent review, don't miss that webinar, which we are broadcasting the first part on Wednesday, the 11th of February. And we will put the date out for the second part in due course. So a huge thank you again to Roy Thorns for being our sponsor for this and our whole of our webinar series. We really do hope that you've enjoyed tonight. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more material like this, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.